Hello everyone, it's me again, Miranda, your friendly trainee clinical psychologist, and today's video is going to be all about childhood trauma. In my opinion, just my humble opinion, childhood trauma is one of the most important subjects that we can learn about, not just for psychologists, but for everyone, because it really does affect more people than you might think, and the impact on the individual can be lifelong if it's not appropriately addressed. Now, there are a few topics that we need to cover today, and I have timestamped everything in the description box below. If there is an area or a subject which speaks to you the most, feel free to have a little skip around the video if you would prefer. I also could not have put this content together without reading lots of other research papers and watching YouTube videos, so I've also linked the most important ones down below so you can have a look through these different resources in your own time if you would like. Like I said, we have a lot to cover. There really is no time to waste, so let's get straight into it. So let's start with the definition. So childhood trauma is when something deeply distressing or disturbing happens to you during your childhood. But there are a couple of things that I'd like to add to this definition. Number one, trauma isn't always just one big, awful incident. It can be a collection of several separate events or prolonged exposure to a more low-level but still very harmful situation or environment. Number two, feeling threatened counts. The threat of something happening to you can be just as traumatic as something actually happening to you. So if you grow up in an environment where you are constantly threatened with physical violence, this can be incredibly traumatic, even if no one actually ends up ever laying a finger on you. Number three, it's not just about bad experiences. So I think people who've experienced trauma can really struggle sometimes because they can say to themselves, well, nothing bad ever really happened to me. But trauma is not just about bad experiences, like I said. It can be the absence of not enough good and joyful experiences as well. Now, as you can see, a lot of things can fall under the childhood trauma banner, but researchers have identified 10 adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which are particularly important to consider. They include things like exposure to violence, abuse, and neglect, and also growing up in a home environment where there is instability and substance misuse. Okay, so I really want to tell you all about how childhood trauma impacts the development of the brain. But before I get into that and start confusing everyone, let's just do a quick recap of the brain and how it all works. So this gorgeous thing right here is your brain. Now let's dissect the brain for a quick second so I can tell you about each of the three main parts. This here is our brainstem, aka the reptilian brain, because it's the oldest part of our brain and looks after our most basic processes like our breathing and heart rate. But the thing that I really want you to remember is that this is the part of the brain that is responsible for kicking off our fight, flight, or freeze response, which happens when we perceive danger. Now, this area here is our limbic system, or our mammalian brain. It has a number of different functions, including relationship behavior and memory processing, but the area that I really want to talk to you about is the amygdala, which is involved in our emotional responses and processing emotional information from our environment. This whole area over here on the top is our cortex, and it's this top layer that does all our fancy stuff, which is why we call it the human brain. It processes information from all our senses. It helps us to imagine, think, plan, analyze, and pay attention. But let me bring your attention to this little bit down here, which is called the prefrontal cortex. This links with all three parts of the brain and helps to integrate or bring together all the information that we get from our body, the world, and other parts of the brain into one harmonious picture that we can make sense of. Another thing that's worth knowing about the brain is that it's made up of these ugly-looking cells called neurons, and neurons can link up with other neurons through these spindly bits called synapses. And it is the synapses which allow these neurons to connect together and to allow different parts of the brain to communicate with each other. So one of the key principles of neuropsychology is that the neurons that fire together wire together. What this means is, as we learn and interact with our environment, certain neurons will start to form really, really strong connections with each other because they are being activated at the same time over and over again. Now, this process is really important because it allows our brain to become more efficient and adapt to the environment that we tend to find ourselves in. Okay, now that we've covered the basics, let's think about the impact of childhood trauma. Okay, to illustrate a point, I'm going to show you a very relevant, very mission-critical image of a watermelon. Let's pretend this watermelon is an adult human brain. Now we're going to cut it in half and cut it in half again, so we are left with something that is 1/4, 25% of the size. This is the size of your brain when you are born. So in the first few years of your life, your brain goes from this size to this size. That is a lot of growth that is happening outside of the womb. And going back to our friendly neurons, when we're born, we actually have about 100 billion of these, which is really similar to that of an adult. But as you can see from this image, we don't actually have many of those connecting fibers, those synapses just yet. And it's those experiences which will determine how these neurons end up linking together. And over time, some of these connections will get really, really strong. To give you an example, let's say these are the neurons in your baby brain. You get hungry, start to cry, and then your parent comes to feed you and comfort you. This is represented in your brain by these neurons starting to build connections. You are learning that when I am hungry, other people will come to help me if I get their attention. If you have a different experience, say you are left alone and ignored, other neurons will start to build connections to represent this experience instead. This is super important because the way our brain connects up will impact how we make sense of the world and how we behave. As you can imagine, the child who tends to experience other people as helpful and kind will likely behave very different to the child who is usually left to fend for themselves. Another thing that can happen when you experience trauma is that the body releases a huge amount of cortisol, which is our stress hormone. This can cause some really significant problems in terms of brain development because it can stop certain synapses growing or actually destroy some of the connections which are already in place. An image that really stayed with me, which illustrates this point, is this study which compared the brains of typical 3-year-old children with ones which had endured extreme neglect. This lack of growth isn't just about the lack of stimulation, it actually shows how prolonged stress can prevent the brain from developing as it should. Finally, going back to our brain areas, trauma can actually cause the amygdala region, where we process emotional information, to grow bigger. And the larger the amygdala, the easier it is to activate the fight, flight, and freeze system. Again, this is super important because when our threat system is activated, our prefrontal cortex can't integrate the information from the brain well at all. It's like flipping your lid. And when you're constantly in this state, you're really going to struggle to control your emotions, regulate your body, and tune into the world and other people around you. When thinking about the impact of childhood trauma on relationships, one of the most important quotes that I've come across is this one, that the most traumatic aspect of all disasters involve the shattering of human connection. And this is so true. As humans, we are social beings to our core. Relationships are vital for our survival, so when these break down, it can cause us real profound emotional, psychological, and even physical pain. And this is really important to hold in mind when we're thinking about childhood trauma, because when we're young, we're still developing what is called our internal working model. This is our understanding of ourselves, others, and relationships. So let's imagine that you grow up surrounded by adults who make you feel loved, they're available, and they are consistent. How do you think that this is going to impact your internal working model? Well, you'll probably start to learn that maybe you are worthy of being loved, that others can be trusted, and that relationships aren't anything to be afraid of. What about now if you have a parent who humiliates you and degrades you? Well, maybe you'll start to think that, hey, I'm no good actually. Other people will probably hurt me, and relationships are something to be avoided at all costs. The The thing about these internal working models is that they create these expectations for how things are going to be moving forwards. And so often we carry the beliefs that we developed in our childhood forward into adulthood. And if you can imagine, if you're going into the world thinking that actually I'm not worth very much and other people are scary and can't be trusted, you're probably going to naturally struggle to build and maintain these healthy relationships, which we know are so essential for our well-being in the long run. Another quote that I really love on this subject is this one, which says that people need to have a satisfying experience of dependency before they can become truly independent. It's basically this idea that we need to have this really good experience of feeling safe and contained and properly looked after before we can become self-reliant. And this is so important to hold on to when we're thinking about adults who actually have grown up without ever having experienced this. Now we've made it this far in the video, it probably comes as absolutely no surprise to you that childhood trauma can have a real profound impact on our mental health. Now I want to introduce you to this concept of the window of effective tolerance. Essentially, we all have this window, and if our level of stimulation and arousal stays within this, we're good. Our feelings are manageable, we can think, we're totally golden. However, when something stressful happens, we can either become hyper-aroused, which is when we find ourselves in our fight or flight mode, and we can start to feel panicked, behave impulsively, and feel really agitated. Or, on the other side, we can become hypo-aroused. This is when we experience our freeze response. We feel numb, spaced out, and can completely shut down. Because of what we've learned about how trauma can impact the area of the brains involved in processing emotional information and setting off our threat response, many people will find that their window of tolerance is much more narrow than other people. So more things can set you off into this threat or danger mode, so you're more likely to struggle to regulate your emotions. We also know that there are these associations between childhood abuse and developing very specific psychological difficulties. So a study by Jansen et al. Actually found that if you'd experienced childhood abuse, you were more likely to develop psychosis as an adult. And what they found was that the severity of abuse was really important here. If you'd experienced abuse which was on the milder end, if we can call it that, you were 2 times more likely to develop psychosis. If you were on the more extreme end, you were up to 48 times more likely to develop psychosis as an adult. Now, another study which looked at these adverse childhood events, these ACEs which I referred to earlier, collected information from 17,500 people, which is absolutely huge for a study in psychology. And what they found is that if you'd experienced 6 or more of these ACEs when you were growing up, you were up to 5,000% more likely to end your life by suicide. So bringing this all together, childhood trauma is absolutely a big deal. It can have this profound impact on our brain development, our mental health, and our relationships. But I don't want to end on this really grim note, because childhood trauma absolutely does not need to define your future. And in fact, I think it's so important to talk about, because with the right relationships, positive experiences, and access to the right support, you can absolutely move forward, thrive, and lead a wonderful life that you want to lead. Now, I did want to also go on to talk about trauma-informed care, but I'm mindful that I don't want to turn this video into a feature length, so I'm going to do everybody a favour and wrap it up for now. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you found it useful, and if you have any thoughts or comments, please do drop them in the comments section below. But until next time, look after yourselves and ciao for now.